Welcome to the Blending In podcast, where we chat with innovative educators who are integrating EdTech. I'm your host, Ashley Yazarlu, and I'm so glad you're listening in today. On today's episode, we have a very special guest, Priten Shah, who is a Harvard grad, educator, entrepreneur, and author of the recently published book, AI and the Future of Education, Teaching in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. I've invited Priten to join the conversation today so you can get an auditory peek into his new book and hear his insights about how AI is changing the learning landscape for us all. So welcome, Priten.
Thank you for having me, Ashley.
So if you want to take a minute and just kind of tell our audience a little bit about who you are, your educational journey, and how you got to where you are now to be in the place to even write this book.
My journey is super non-traditional. So I started my first education technology venture back in high school. I was a sophomore, trying to figure out ways to spread, make tutoring more accessible. And so we did pre-recorded videos, put them online, did some email back and forth with students all around the world. And this is before all this stuff was the norm. I realized that right now someone's like, that's not really innovative, but back then it was kind of cool for folks still. And so that was the first venture that I started, and then it's been various projects throughout there that's all kind of tackle education from different angles. I have a civics nonprofit that tries to use technology to make civics education more accessible. I've worked on mastery learning projects with clients. And I've taught summer camps every year. I taught for 6 months in a public school in New York City, worked in Korea for about 6 months, teaching English. So just tried to expose myself to all different parts of education, worked at a private school, coaching debate. So a very wide variety of the educational context while building out different solutions for problems I saw. And then, while I've built these relationships and connections over the years, and we've always talked about AI in some hypothetical, this would be really cool if we could type of scenario. And then about a year ago, about a little bit more than a year ago, all that became possible. All the kinds of things we were dreaming about kind of all became reality overnight. And so I got really excited. And so I was trying to figure out, okay, which clients can I first help integrate this with? What projects can I start putting out that will use the technology that now makes a lot of solutions that I think will solve a lot of our problems possible. And people were freaking out. Nobody was ready for that at that point.
Yeah.
And so that's when I was like, okay, wait, take a step back, Priten. And kind of the book came out of that. It was just okay, let's start folks off with what is the big picture? What do they need to know in order to actually navigate or even to have the conversations or be open to the kinds of solutions and innovations that I hope could actually come out of this. So the book is meant to kind of take that middle ground of okay, here's everything an educator needs to know tomorrow in order to figure out what's going on, make sense of the news headlines, and make sense of some of the technology coming out. And also just here's where we should exercise some caution. Yes, everybody's right to be a little scared, right to be a little terrified of this stuff. And I kind of hope that I ask the right questions and put some insight into how we can navigate those as well.
Yeah. I mean, I was reading through your book and you mentioned just a second ago that this new thing just came upon us a year and a half ago, right? And just blew everybody's minds. And you wrote in your book, we stand at the precipice of a new era in education. And it's through this blending of traditional pedagogical strategies with innovative AI tech that we can usher in this new age of learning. So I'm really interested in that, thinking from the perspective of teachers, and that longer term conversation that must involve embracing and making room for AI to ensure the classrooms meet the needs of our students, as you wrote in the book. So how can teachers blend in those opportunities to use AI to do just that?
That was not planned, but yes, blending is exactly what I think needs to be the solution to figuring out how exactly we can, take the things that we care about. So I think the way I like to explain to folks is the kinds of things that we've wanted to do in our classrooms, the kinds of things we value in our classrooms, the kind of learners we want our students to be, and the long-term goals we have as educators have not changed overnight. Those are all exactly the same they were before AI became popular and everybody started grappling with it. What's really changed is the tools we have in the society that all the context within which we need to achieve those goals. And so this is where like we can take a lot of pedagogical strategies that we've been trying, inquiry-based learning, problem-based learning, project-based learning, all the active learning, all those kinds of things that we've all been trying to figure out how to integrate within our like teaching repertoire, and use AI for it, and also use AI to use that to combat AI and the rise of plagiarism and cheating and the kinds of assignments that became obsolete. So I try to encourage teachers to start thinking about how can we reframe some of the work that we're doing in our classrooms, our assessments especially, to take advantage of the technology instead of just like trying to get around it, like AI detectors and plagiarism detectors, and like let's record student screens while they're writing essays. Like none of that. No one actually wants to do any of that. Like that, no one is excited every morning getting up, like trying to figure out how to detect AI use. And I'm hoping that as we think about it, and we can talk a lot today about it as well, but folks figure out how they can like use AI in order to build better assessments and build better tools that help students learn, that they start to see that like everything they wanted for their students is still there, and the students still need it. And now we just have more resources to make that happen, and maybe even like push us to use those.
Yeah, I love that. I love how you're basically saying the pedagogy is not going away. It's still the same. It's just we're reframing how we tackle it and what goes into like the planning and the tools that we use. So you discuss in your book how AI can sort of lighten the workload and help teachers with content generation. So how do you think AI can help with planning for like blended learning activities? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, my first piece of advice to folks, especially if you're like new to the technology, will be to ask that exact question in your context to an AI system. So one of the ways I think oftentimes folks, when they initially heard about it, thought, okay, like this is a lesson plan generator, this is a worksheet generator. But one of the cool things about like, especially the ones that are built for conversational settings like Bard, ChatGPT, one of the cool things is you can actually have a nice conversation in a way that like serves as your little thinking buddy, as your assistant, and so if you have a particular activity you're already doing and try to figure out a way to blend it in, you can start brainstorming with any of these tools. And so that would be my first little piece of advice is like go ahead and ask ChatGPT. Like I have this assessment I normally do. I have this unit I'm trying to teach. How might I blend technology into it? How might I make sure that both those components are active for the students? But you know, that obviously we can also talk a little bit about specific things today. And so I think one of my favorite things to think about is like how can we make the classroom like the most active way possible? Because I think now that like a lot of our assessment criteria are becoming a little bit less effective. I think like being able to have students engage in like lively discussions and in role plays and simulations inside classrooms are all like way more effective and way more fun for everybody. And then how can we tell students to basically take advantage of all the learning they can do now using AI outside of the classroom? So prepare for a debate using an AI system to like kind of do your research, kind of come up with your arguments, even debate with an AI system first so that you're prepared to engage in the debate in class the next day, right? Those are kind of examples that I think really take advantage of all the benefits that AI is putting out for students to do at home learning, and then still find ways to like assess and do projects within the classroom that kind of build on that rather than try to like, avoid students exposure to the technology, and kind of like, hide away from it in a way that I think is hurting our students.
Yeah, and I love the ideas that you just threw out here. You go into a lot more depth in your book with some of those ideas of like how to actually use tools like ChatGPT and others to write in prompts for different types of learning activities. And you mentioned like project-based learning. So thinking about like different instructional models that keep students actively engaged, what instructional models do you think blend well with AI integration?
Yeah, I do think project-based learning is one of the coolest ones. I think it's the most like real interdisciplinary way to like get students engaged in a topic area. And so I think we've been trying to help teachers conceptualize assessments that take place outside of the classroom, that are like robust projects that kind of allow students to take a little path of intellectual curiosity through the topic that's interesting to them, and then almost like kind of have a variety of options for them to engage in whatever like summative assessment you want at the end, through a various, creating something. So everything from like having students host a podcast for a little bit, or having them come up with a website project, an app project. One of the reasons that I think the AI systems really start making this more exciting for folks is that you can actually get much farther in a project than you could without AI. So instead of trying to figure out like how do we replace and make sure that we can still test the same things, we can kind of figure out what might be the next thing to test. And so maybe if you ask students to just write a podcast script for an assessment. You can now have students actually like have an AI voice, put on the podcast. I do an interview with, right? Like there's so many more interactive things that students can now do without having to spend a lot more time on it, and actually get like full final fleshed projects out of it. And we've been seeing college professors who like now like their end of semester assessments are like go do the most crazy, right? Like the craziest thing you could possibly do now, because you
Yeah.
can like code a website using AI. You can kind of have a lot of copy drafted really quickly with AI. And so, what is the application of whatever you're trying to assess? And how can you have the students kind of take a creative route with it? Students are so much more engaged that way. I mean, I think everybody knows that like when a student gets to like kind of take ownership of their project, take ownership of exactly which aspect of the topic they care about, they're excited. They are proud of the work they put out. And so I think this is a great way to start thinking about, and it's also real. Like that's
Yeah.
exactly what they'll be doing in their careers is building projects with AI as support, and then interacting with other humans with it, right? So I think like
Yeah.
that's some good real world practice for them.
Yeah, you actually hit on one of my other questions was how can AI impact student engagement and like the kids' motivation to do the hard work of learning? Because as you know, as a Harvard graduate, like doing the work of learning is hard. And sometimes kids just want to give up or they tune out, they're disengaged. So how do you think AI impacts that?
Yeah. So unfortunately, I think the first answer is that AI is making it worse. I think in the short term, we're starting to see like students disengage further because they like are like AI can already do this. Why do I need to learn it? Like that question just becomes we've always had to answer why learn this for our students, but I think right now it just like feels a bit more like a quick transition. So I think there's a little bit of loss of motivation from that when we're already seeing massive like loss in student engagement post COVID. And I think folks are tired of technology post COVID. Like everyone just like
Yeah.
associates like e-learning and online learning with like Zoom, and that's like
Hmm.
hopefully we can start to reframe that a little bit and talk about the advantages of it. But I think in our heads right now, it's that like the trauma, honestly, of those 2 years is so robust that I think it's hard to like detangle the like what is ed tech and what is education technology and technological solutions for education that aren't just us all getting on Zoom and being miserable. So I think part of that is like all making it worse. There's also like it is easier for them to cheat, and so this is where like slightly reframing what you're assessing and how you're assessing is important because a student at 3 a.m. in the morning who has an essay due the next day is going to take advantage of AI technology to cheat. Like they're stressed out. They're worried about what the implications of them like not doing it are. The motivation to cheat and like use that AI technology as a crutch is really high. The goal though is that we can hopefully do some of that reframing using the AI. So while I think that like right now everybody's kind of trying to figure out how do we deal with this like short term, even further dip in engagement. I'm hoping
Hmm.
that as we blend in the technology a bit more into how we're framing assessments, how we're talking to students, that we start to see a rise in it. Because I think we have the potential to let students go on these learning journeys, I think, as I've been calling them, where they can kind of explore topics from so many different angles that are actually of interest to them. Like we don't all care about the same things, and that's just like
Sure.
that's fundamentally true about humans, and not nor do our students. And so we have fundamental things we need to teach them. Like everybody maybe needs to learn some basic arithmetic, but hopefully, like word problems can be more engaging to students because they tackle areas of interest to the student. And so, if there's a student who wants to do word problems about like I don't know sports versus somebody who wants to do it about like politics and climate change, like that, those kinds of the variety of assessments to kind of personalize that the learning for the student becomes more possible with AI technologies, and that's really exciting to me because I think we can start to show students why everything that we think is core to what they need to learn actually intersects with the things that they care about. And that's
Yeah.
something that normally takes a lot of human effort to like sit there in a room of 30 students and tell each kid like why learning like 2 plus 2 would be useful for their particular interest. But AI can do that for us.
Yeah, so tapping into those personal interests, giving them choice, and using that AI as a way to sort of like give them that autonomy and like launch them into their interests. I love that so much. Um, you also stated in the book too that we need to make progress on closing the digital divide. So, what are some ways that you think that AI can make learning landscapes more equitable to help close that gap?
Yeah. This is, and again, this is one of those things where I think like initially we're going to see some like bad impacts in education and cause the problem to get worse. I think that we're already starting to see like some schools are engaging with AI, some are not, only furthering like the
Sure.
students' tech literacy. That bans in particular schools, embracing in other schools, all those kinds of things will like make the divide worse for a little bit. I'm hoping again that we can start to see that AI technologies can help make our education system more equitable. And so I think the book has lots of examples about how to like use it for differentiation, how to use it to get ESL students assignments that are like particularly catered towards whatever native language they're speaking. There's ways to kind of differentiate even like the form of the media by which we're delivering information. And so, for example, you might be able to start putting out like you might have a lecture and a nicely cleaned up transcript of it or translation of it even much more quickly than you could in the past. And then the personalized learning part is also an important part of this. I think there are students who are way too shy to ask a question in class. They might be struggling and it's not harder for them to reach out to a teacher, or in a classroom of 30, 35 students, they might be getting missed a little bit. And hopefully the more individualized the learning process can be through AI, we can find those kids and kind of meet them and kind of give them the resources they need to maybe even get to the point where they can reach out for help by kind of like getting some of those early questions answered by AI.
Yeah. I love that so much. Like when COVID happened and our district shut down, our district was really proactive about providing our students with hotspots so that everybody had access.
Right.
And I really feel like that's something that we need to consider as a nation is like how do we get every kid access to this technology? You mentioned a minute ago a kid who's up at 3 a.m. that has a paper due, right? Like some kids may not have the technology at home to be able to complete that paper at 3 a.m. even if they wanted to. So we just need to figure out like how can we get that to be large scale. Everybody has access, just like everybody should have access to water and a roof over their head. They should also have access to the technology, I think.
And I agree, and I think this is where, like, I think hopefully as we start to see the impacts of like the divide getting worse. I mean, it's already pretty bad, right? Like when we saw some of that during COVID, like there were folks who
hmm
districts who had to overnight figure out how to do a one-to-one program. There were folks who like even if they got a device into a student's hand, the student didn't have internet access or a stable living location to make use of it, and all those kinds of things. I think we were just like highlight that like the same thing that we all know already, that education is not just a unidimensional problem to solve. Like in order to get to help our students best, like we kind of need to tackle this from different angles.
Yeah.
Internet access and device access is a big part of that.
Yeah. And with access, obviously you just talked about a little bit sometimes the the motivation or lack of motivation students have with it, how it can sometimes be a, a distraction or the AI is going to do this for me, so I don't need to do it kind of attitude comes into play. Is there I guess a safe AI that you would recommend that it would be like a good starter tool for teachers to integrate into the classroom to help kind of start to bridge that gap between traditional learning and learning with AI?
I'll have to make a little plug for a tool that I put out that I think I made to solve this problem. So
Okay.
Socrat.ai is our custom teacher bot. And basically lets teachers assign like a very particular thing for a student to like kind of talk to AI with. And so there's no this open like wild west of like I can talk to ChatGPT about anything, ask any question, and kind of take it anywhere. Our AI bot, like the student can only talk about the topic that the teacher has assigned. And it kind of lets them do different kinds of assignments based on what exactly the application in the classroom is. And so there's like a Socratic dialogue system. And so the student can kind of engage in a Socratic dialogue with Socrat about a particular topic that they're interested in or the topic that the teacher has assigned. And everybody's having an individual Socratic dialogue. So maybe in a classroom setting, they might not feel as comfortable like engaging in that dialogue. Maybe they're only raising their hand the minimum number of times you've told them they have to. But here they're kind of forced to engage in the entire Socratic process alone. And then maybe that makes them feel ready for the actual Socratic dialogue in the classroom the next day. And that's where we're really, like, our goal isn't for these tools to feel like complete replacements for in-class instruction. They're really supposed to help scaffold some of that and make some of that much more palatable to students who maybe find it a little bit more intimidating to come to class and only be like having a discussion where that's their assessment method. We have a debate bot where the student can kind of like debate with Socrat. They have a language role play model where like the student can practice their language skills. So for example, they might be like a customer in a restaurant in Mexico City while like Socrat role plays as the waiter. And then that exact thing can happen in the classroom the next day. But again, like that, building that confidence and that fluency for the students before they come into the classroom can kind of make sure that like when you're in the classroom, you're tackling like maybe the basic vocabulary they're building outside, but then you're helping them tackle the intonations that are proper for the language or the exact, maybe there's like different respectful forms that maybe like they're not fully grasping, but now they have the vocabulary and basic grammar structures, right? So I'm hoping that a classroom experience then like can tackle the hardest things and the most human things.
I love that idea of role playing with a chat bot. That's awesome.
I was gonna say, like, I mean, I think that like that's the kind of thing that excites me a lot because I think especially as we see like AR, VR being brought into classrooms, and I think that's a little bit farther away than I think the AI integrations are. I think we can like help students like really think about where the applications of whatever they're learning are in the real world. And I think that helps engagement, right? Like I think part of the like when it's so disconnected, when you siloed out like all these different disciplines into like really the standardized tests, like all those kinds of things really like remove knowledge from the real world. And I'm hoping that we can use AI to kind of reconnect that for students because all of these, there's reasons we want them to learn these things, right? There's like, it's not just like to pass the like test at the end of the year. There's really good reasons why when they're adults and walking around in the world, like, you know, this knowledge will help them in some way. And hopefully the role playing with AI is one way they can start using that in that way, right? So like maybe they're like pretending to be a senator on the floor of the Senate and like engaging in a debate with another senator about a policy issue and not just learning about like, oh, Senate has 100 senators, right? Like these kinds of things might help students actually see like there's much more value. There's a lot more value to like learning all these different things than like the test at the end of the year.
I love that. That's awesome. So as we kind of close out our conversation today, what advice do you have for teachers who may be sort of tech hesitant about integrating AI into the classroom? They're maybe fearful that the conversation with the role play and the chatbot might go sideways, or kids are using it for plagiarism. Like, what advice do you have for teachers who may have those fears?
Yeah, I think first is like all those fears are valid, and I think that that's part of like the conversations that I think we all need to be having is that like there are really good reasons to be a little bit slower in integrating. There's really good reasons to kind of like take a step back, learn a little bit more about the technology, kind of figure out how you can find tools that are safe for students versus not safe for students. And then I think like it's a good idea to dive in yourself first. So my first recommendation to a teacher would never be to like figure out a way to integrate it with the student workflow right away. I think figuring out how it works for you best helps you kind of build that fluency to then talk to students about it. And so go see if like AI can do something for you that's like on your to-do list, right? Or you know, use it for that brainstorming activity I started with, where you're trying to figure out how to blend in technology more, and go ask ChatGPT and have a conversation yourself with no other implications, but like as a PD buddy. And start to see the potential for the technology, start to see what the conversational aspect of it does. Because I think we saw a lot of folks either who were extremely scared of like putting this in front of students, and so they're just like, okay, like how do we deal with fans? How do we deal with detection? And then we see folks who like kind of used it a little bit and like put in like, oh, I want a lesson plan about the water cycle, and then saw something that wasn't exactly what they would produce and kind of walked away from it. And I'm hoping that folks can kind of start to reframe this and see, well, you can actually tell it what you didn't like about the lesson plan, right? This isn't like a push button and like it's just done type of system. Like sit there and actually talk to it as if it was a teaching assistant. And that might help start for you to start to see the value of it. But also kind of like also help ease the transition into like thinking about the technology and what it can do and what it can't.
You know, I think the big idea here is reframing our mindset about AI in education. So that's great advice, Priten. Thank you so much. If you want to know more about how AI is impacting the future of education, be sure to check out Priten's book. I will link it as well as the websites that he mentioned during our chat today in the show notes of this episode. But thank you again, Priten, for joining me today. It's been such an insightful conversation.
That's fun.
Thanks for listening to the Blending In podcast. I hope you gleaned some inspiration to blend in EdTech into your instruction. You can find show notes and resources from today's episode on my website, blendinginpodcast.com. If you loved what you heard today, leave a review, follow the podcast on socials, and hit the subscribe button to get notified when new episodes are released. Until next time, don't hesitate to innovate and integrate.